Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode. Today, we're getting into the accounts on medieval Africa. So, we'll be analyzing writings from Ibn Battuta, Leo Africanus, and Al Bakri. In this episode, we will primarily be focusing on Ibn Battuta. And then we're going to get into what Leo Africanus wrote about and Al Bakri another time in other episodes. So it's like a mini series, but still part of the larger series. I laid the groundwork in the episode titled Islam's Historical Journey Across Africa, Trade, Empires, and I believe Cultural Context. I think that's what I put in the title. So I laid the groundwork because if we want to get into other things, uh, it would be a little bit confusing to understand what was going on if people didn't already know that for centuries these regions already had contact with Islam and had Islam thriving there. But the way in which it had manifested is going to be looked at now. But at the same time, it's not just about the religion. The religion will be a part of the grander framework of this podcast episode. Before we get into that, though, I wanted to say thank you to the French speaking listeners for being patient. I put out the podcast on YouTube so you guys can go watch it in it's in English, of course, but you guys can go watch it with French subtitles. Je veux dire ça en français. Pour ceux qui parlent français, ou bien pour les francophones, j'ai ajouté le podcast sur YouTube. Donc, vous pouvez aller là-bas et écouter ou bien regarder avec des sous-titres en français. Merci d'avoir patienté parce que je sais que ça a pris un peu de temps. Oui, ça a pris un peu de temps. Now, back to the topic. We are going to put a quick disclaimer. Some of the terminology and expressions used by these explorers, mainly Ibn Battuta, might be seen as abrasive depending on who's listening. So I'm just putting that out there. This podcast episode isn't focusing on who said what, and well, yes, it is, but it's not focused on how someone has said it. We are focusing on what they've observed and how we can analyze that so that we can get a better look into the past. I particularly chose these writers, specifically Ibn Battuta, in this episode because I like the fact that he gets straight to the point. The things he doesn't mince words. He clearly articulates how he feels. He probably didn't articulate exactly how he felt in person, like verbally to other people, unless it was trustworthy people. But he did articulate them quite extensively in the Rihla. So he's quite descriptive, which is what I love about this explorer. So, a little bit on the background of Ibn Battuta. He is said to have been born in 1304 and passed away in 1369. He was named Abu Abdullah ibn Battuta. He was a Moroccan scholar and he was a qadi, which is a judge in English, and an explorer. He was often referred to as the quote unquote Marco Polo of the Muslim world. However, his travels did exceed those of Marco Polo in both distance and scope. Over 30 years, he covered a vast expanse of the world, many regions. From North and West Africa to the Middle East, he has been to East Africa and Central Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asian countries like China, and parts of Europe. And his travelogue, which is the Rihla, called The Journey, provides really good accounts of the diverse cultures, societies, and political dynamics of the 14th century. So, his extensive travels and detailed observations offer an interesting perspective on the interconnectedness of the medieval world at the time. I shall now narrate what he wrote. We reached the town of Walata after a journey from Sijil Masa of 2 months to a day. Walata is the northernmost province of the Negroes, or blacks. When we arrived there, the merchants deposited their goods in an open square where the blacks undertook to guard them and went to the Farba, which is the Sultan's representative. He was sitting on a carpet under an archway, with his guards before him carrying lances and bows in their hands, and the headmen of the Musafa behind him. The merchants remained standing in front of him while he spoke to them through an interpreter. Although they were close to him, he showed his contempt for them. It was then that I had repented for having come to their country, because of their lack of manners and their contempt for the whites. What does this mean? Let's break it down. Firstly, Walata is a province, it's within present day Mauritania. That's one. Two, he has made an assumption based off of observation of the people there. And three, he didn't call them Africans. He said the blacks. Back then, they understood it to be the land of the quote unquote blacks, a Sudan. Fourthly, he talked about the contempt for the whites. But we have to look at this from the perspective of classical Arabic. He was not an Arab, he was what they would call a Berber today, but he wrote and spoke classical Arabic. In classical Arabic, black and white can carry several different meanings depending on context in the language, which is why I think it's very important to learn Arabic if you want to learn anything about Islam or any kind of history where someone or an explorer is writing anything in classical Arabic. So we're going to break that down because the terminology of the blacks or the whites is understood differently back then in that context compared to what it is understood in the modern sense. So the blacks, which is As Sudan, and the whites, which is Al Baidan, in his Rihla reflects the social, cultural, and historical understanding of ethnicity and race, whatever you call it, during those times. And the categorization was done with different intentions for different reasons. So, As Sudan, it literally means the black people, and it's referring to the inhabitants of what is now called sub-Saharan Africa, particularly those living in Western Sudan region, which includes present-day Mali, Senegal, Niger, and surrounding areas. So this designation was not purely about skin color, but it was also tied to geography and cultural identity. So this term was used broadly in the Islamic world, and it didn't imply a uniform racial category. Now, what whites mean, which is al Baidan, it refers to the lighter skinned people of the Maghreb or North Africa and parts of the Middle East. It wasn't synonymous with white in the modern European context. Instead, it described populations of lighter complexions compared to sub Saharan Africans. This term was often applied by Ibn Battuta towards present day Moroccans, present day Egyptians, and present day Arabians. The context is quite fluid, it's not very rigid in terms of ethnic and racial category. Uh, you will see this happening in other African languages. But if they were to translate that literally into English, they would call you white. So somebody could be born in Africa to sub Saharan African parents, and they would be called quote unquote white simply because they are lighter skinned. And it doesn't mean that they were born in Europe or mixed with European or anyone of European descent. It's just culturally and linguistically, that's what is translated into English, but it doesn't necessarily mean what people think it means today. So during Ibn Battuta's time, people were generally categorized based on regional, cultural, and religious identities rather than rigid racial constructs. So, black people could be someone from the Mali Empire who was Muslim and therefore considered part of the broader Islamic Muslim Ummah or the community, sharing religious identity with lighter skinned Arabs or Berbers. Similarly, quote unquote white referred more to regional and ethnic distinctions, which is the Arabs, the Berbers, than what we now understand to be quote unquote Caucasian or people of European descent today. Now we're going to get into the next passage. I went to visit Ibn Battuta, a worthy man of Saleh, to whom I had written requesting him to hire a house for me, and he had done so. Later on, the inspector of Walatan, whose name is Mansa, invited all those who had come from the caravan to partake of his hospitality. At first, I refused to attend, but my companions urged me very strongly, so I went with the rest. The food was served, some which was pounded millet, mixed with a little honey and milk, put in a half calabash shaped like a large bowl. The guests drank and retired. I said to them, "Was it for this that the blacks invited us?" They answered, "Yes, and it is in our opinion the highest form of hospitality." This convinced me that there was no good to be hoped from these people, and I made up my mind to travel back to Morocco with a pilgrim caravan from Walatan. Afterwards, however, I thought it best to go see their capital of their king, which is the Kingdom of Mali. My stay at Walatan lasted about 50 days, and I was shown honor and entertained with its inhabitants. It is an extensively hot place. The garments of its inhabitants are of fine Egyptian fabrics. Their women are of surpassing beauty and shown more respect than the men. The state of affairs amongst these people is indeed extraordinary. Their men show no signs of jealousy whatsoever. No one claims descent from their father, but on the contrary, from their mother's brother. A person's heirs are his sister's sons, not his own sons. This is a thing which I have seen nowhere in the world except among the Indians of Malabar. But those are heathens, and these are Muslims, punctilious in observing the hours of prayer, studying books of law, and memorizing the Quran. Yet their women show no bashfulness amongst men and do not veil themselves, though they are assiduous in attending the prayers. Any man who wishes to marry one of them may do so, but they do not travel with their husbands, and even if one desired to do so, her family would not allow her to go. Okay, we've got some stuff to unpack here. He talked about Egyptian fabrics. Yes, Egyptian fabrics and different types of fabrics from other parts of the world, even European fabrics, were recorded to be found there. And this is due to a lot of the trade. During that time, these empires, Mali, Songhai, they secured the trade routes, very big trade routes. There was a huge exchange of different goods, fabrics, spices, ornaments, you name it. Secondly, he talked about women being shown more respect than men. This is also contextual. It depends what people may think respect towards women means. The women were participating more in society compared to other societies that he's been to. And this is backed by some evidence where during the time the Mali Empire was established, within the clause in oral narrations, women were not confined to homes, irrespective of religious identity. Women were active participants in the society, and it was in a very traditional sense at the time within their context. Many also owned their own property at the time. Now, this isn't just within this region in Africa. There are many places around the world where this had happened. But like I said, maybe the parts of the world that he was in or his cultural background or his familial background could have filtered the way in which he understands gender dynamics. And he talked about a person's heirs are his sister's sons, not his own sons. I've actually heard of this. This isn't something that happened just back then. It's still happening to some extent in certain places. I had a conversation with my dad about a super rural area in our country, Niger. And over there, despite the chieftaincy being given to the men, the land would actually be given to the brothers or sons of their sister's side. So it was chosen from the women's side. So they were patriarchal societies, and then they were also matrilineal societies as well. It was very diverse. What he says about this particular place doesn't necessarily translate to all the places. Although a lot of things have changed recently, as time has passed, and the way in which people are now seeing gender norms in terms of religion or in terms of tradition, etc. He also mentions how they were not as, let's say, prudish in terms of interacting with one another. He didn't mention it being too over the top, but it may have been too over the top for him, in which he had understood Islam to be, him being a judge and all, but there were also judges there. It was a bit of a cultural shock to him because these people were reading Quran, and not just reading, but he said that they had engaged in understanding the laws, Islamic laws. It wasn't just memorization. So he couldn't understand how this came to be. And another thing that shocked him was that a man could marry a woman. However, if he would travel, she would not go with him. And even if he or she wanted to go with him during his travels, then her family would have her stay back. I have done research on that, but I haven't found concrete evidence as to why certain um, certain African societies had done that. There have been a lot of research pointing to the assumption that women were very involved in the society, were very involved within the community. He could spend years traveling, but he would come back and still find her. This wasn't the case in all places, but these are some of the assumptions or some of the explanations given in certain research. We're going to get back to the next text of what he's talking about. This is still in the Mali Empire. When I decided to make the journey to Mali, which is reached in 24 days from Walatan, if the traveler pushes on rapidly, I hired a guide, for there is no necessity to travel in a company on account of the safety of that road. The river Niger descends from Timbuktu to Gaugao, both of which will be described later. Then we went to the town of Muli in the land of Limis, which is in the frontier province of Mali, thence to Yufi, which is the largest town of the Negroes, whose ruler is one of the most considerable amongst the Negro rulers. It cannot be visited by any white man because he would kill him before he even got there. Thus I reached the city of Mali, the capital of the king of the blacks. I stopped at the cemetery and went to the quarter occupied by the whites, where I had asked for Muhammad ibn al-Faqih. I found that he had hired a house for me, and so we went there. His son-in-law brought me candles and food, and the next day Ibn al-Faqih himself came to visit me with other prominent residents. I met the judge of Mali. His name is Abdurrahman, and he came to see me. He is a black, a pilgrim, and a man of fine character. I also met the interpreter, Dora, who is one of the principal men amongst the blacks. All these people sent me hospitality gifts of food and treated me with the utmost generosity. May God reward them for their kindness. As for this part, he found no reason to go with a large company in his travels from the town of Walata to the city of Mali, which is the capital of the empire. And he thought it to be safe. This is a stark contrast with what we now understand these roads to be today. So back then, it was very safe. He didn't even feel like he needed a lot of people to come with him, and in case bandits would come and steal their stuff just because they were travelers. Another thing is he mentioned a community of whites there. Now, remember, we talked about the whole terminology blacks, whites, in terms of those times. And we are going to assume that these were Berbers or Arabs. We still have a lot of these communities here till today. Now, he mentioned hospitality gifts, gifts of food and other things of generosity. Like I said before, this is what I liked about this traveler. If he saw something he didn't like, he would write it down. And if he assumed good, he would also write it down. So he was quite unfiltered in the way he articulated his feelings and emotions about his observations. He was quite human. He saw things subjectively, he also saw things objectively at the same time. Now we're going to get back to his journal. The king of Mali is Mansa Suleiman. Mansa meaning sultan or ruler in the Madingo language, and Suleiman being his proper name. He is a miserly king, not a man whom you might hope for a rich present. It happened that I spent these 2 months without seeing him on account of my illness. Later on, he held a banquet in commemoration of the late Sultan of Morocco, Abul Hassan, to which his commanders, doctors, qadis or judges, and preachers were invited, and I went along with them. When the ceremony was over, I went forward and saluted Mansa Suleiman. The Qadi, the preacher, and Ibn al-Faqih told him who I was, and he answered to them in their tongue. Then they said to me, "The Sultan says to you, give thanks to God." So I said, "Praise be to God, and thanks under all circumstances." When I withdrew, the Sultan's hospitality gift was sent to me. Ibn al-Faqih came hurrying out of his house, barefooted, and entered my room, saying, "Stand up! Here comes the Sultan's stuff and gift to you." So I stood up thinking, since he had called it stuff, it consisted of robes and honor, of money, and lo, it was 3 cakes of bread and a piece of beef fried in native oil and a calabash of sour curds. When I saw this, I burst out laughing and thought it was the most amazing thing that they could be so foolish and make so much of such a paltry matter. On certain days, the Sultan holds audiences in the palace yard, where there is a platform under a tree with 3 steps. This they call the Pempi. It is carpeted with silk and has cushions placed on it. Over it is raised the umbrella, which is a sort of pavilion made of silk, surmounted by a bird in gold, about the size of a falcon. The Sultan comes out of a door in a corner of the palace, carrying a bow in his hand and a quiver on his back. On his head, he has a golden skull cap bound with a gold band which has narrow ends shaped like knives. His usual dress is a velvety red tunic made of European fabrics. The Sultan is preceded by his musicians who carry gold and silver guimbras. These are 2-stringed guitars, and behind him come 300 armed slaves. He walks in a leisurely fashion, affecting a very slow movement, and even stops from time to time. On reaching the Pempi, he stops and looks around the assembly, then ascends it in a sedate manner of a preacher ascending a mosque pulpit. As he takes his seat, the drums, trumpets, and the bulges are sounded. 3 slaves go out to summon the sovereign's deputy and the military commanders, who enter and sit. 2 saddled with bridled horses are brought, along with 2 goats, which they hold to serve as a protection against the evil eye. Dora stands at the gate, and the rest of the people remain in the street under the trees. The blacks are of all people the most submissive to their king and the most abject in their behavior before him. They swear by his name, saying Mansa Suleiman ki, which means in Madingo, the Emperor Suleiman has commanded. If he summons one of them while he's holding an audience in his pavilion, the person summoned goes to take off his clothes and puts on worn garments, removes his turban, and dons a sturdy skullcap. And he enters with his garments and trousers raised knee high. He goes forward in an attitude of humility and dejection and knocks the ground hard with his elbows. Then he stands with his head bowed and bent back, listening to what he says. If anyone addresses the king and receives a reply from him, he uncovers his head and throws dust over his head and back. I used to wonder how these people did not blind themselves. If the sultan delivers any remarks during his audience, those present take off their turbans and put them down and listen in silence to what he says. Sometimes one of them stands up before him and recalls his deeds in the sultan's service, saying, I did such and such on such day, or I killed so and so on such a day. Those who have knowledge of this confirm his words, which they do by plucking the cord of the bow, releasing it with a twang, just as an archer does when shooting an arrow. If the sultan says, truly spoken, or thanks him, he receives his clothes and dusts. That is their idea of good manners. The blacks possess some admirable qualities. They are seldom unjust and have a greater abhorrence of injustice than other people. So we pause so that we can break everything down. He has reached the city of Mali. He has already settled in. He's already given his opinion on certain things. And he has met the emperor, the ruler of the Mali Empire. This ruler's name is Mansa Suleiman. He ruled from 1341 to 1360, and he was the successor to the famous Mansa Musa. So this timeline is after the passing of Mansa Musa. He doesn't like the king that much. Perhaps he imagined that he would receive a lot of the gifts that he usually receives in other places. So this is context based. He has been to other places in even in East Africa and other parts of the world. And in those places, if he is known to be a judge, he's received with a lot more openness. They are less open, according to him, compared to the other people. The Emperor Suleiman had revered the late emperor of what is now called Morocco at the time, and they held a huge feast for that, and they did a lot of Quran recitations, which is something that is actually quite common in a lot of places, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. If there are feasts or if there's a gathering, specifically religious gathering, people are going to bring a lot of preachers to recite a lot of Quran. I personally have been to one here in Senegal. It was quite the spectacular experience, I would say. I wasn't used to it because the way in which they do it differs a little bit. The way in which other parts of the West African nations do it, but it was very nice. He also talks about the procession of the sultan or ruler and how he carries himself. So the ruler walks in a slow manner. It sounds quite theatrical from the way he explains it here in his journal. It's as if he was watching a performance. There was a lot of decorum happening. He mentioned that the blacks are very submissive or subservient towards their ruler. Another thing is he mentioned their superstitions. People would bring in certain things like goats and bridled horses to ward off quote unquote evil eye. These were traditional things happening. Despite them being Muslim, they had their cultural aspects that they fused Islam into. But like I said in my last episode, Islam's historical journey across Africa, that transformed, then some people ended up not continuing these beliefs about warding off evil eye with amulets. Some people still do, some people don't. It's a very fascinating way to see how Islam has manifested in day-to-day lives of the people. Another thing he mentions is how they throw dust over their heads or over their backs. He even kind of gave a little a witty comment about that. Well, I'm not exactly sure what that means, the whole dust throwing thing. I'd have to do more research about that. We will now get back to the continuation of his journey in Mali. The blacks possess some admirable qualities. They are seldom unjust and have a greater abhorrence of injustice than any other people. Their sultan shows no mercy to anyone who is guilty of the least act of it. There is complete security in their country. Neither traveler nor inhabitant in it has anything to fear from robbers or men of violence. They do not confiscate the property of any white man who dies in their country, even if it be uncounted wealth. On the contrary, they give it into the charge of some trustworthy person among the whites until the rightful heir takes possession of it. They are careful to observe the hours of prayer and assiduous in attending them in congregations and in bringing up their children to them. Another of their good qualities is their habit of wearing clean white garments on Friday. Even if a man has nothing but an old worn shirt, he washes it and cleans it and wears it to the Friday service. Yet another is their zeal for learning the Quran by heart. They put their children in chains if they show any backwardness in memorizing it, and they are not set free until they have learned it by heart. I once visited the Qadi in his house on a day of a festival. His children were chained up, so I said to him, "Will you not let them loose?" He replied, "I shall not do so until they learn the Quran by heart." So we're going to break this down. He went on to talking about the qualities that he found favorable among blacks in the region. And he said that they do not like injustice at the time. Injustice was a no no. Their abhorrence of injustice was greater than any other people. He reiterates that travelers and inhabitants of the region do not fear robbers or men of violence. He felt a sense of peace. He felt a sense of security. And this is big coming from a traveler because travelers and foreigners tend to be the ones who are easily targeted by robbers. He didn't really have to think about that. He also mentioned that blacks here were very careful about the minorities within their region. Even if someone within the white community passed away, they let these white communities govern themselves in this particular case. Now, one of the things that he found admirable was something that would be seen as very alarming. They would chain people, particularly children, until they finished memorizing whatever they had to memorize that. And he found that admirable. Perhaps being a scholar, a Muslim scholar, is close to his heart. And so he thought that, wow, this extreme form of quote unquote devotion is an admirable aspect. Now, there are a lot of ways to see this, and it is controversial to change somebody, especially when there is no compulsion within the religion. But I've heard this is still happening in some places. And if you were to tell the common person in the cities or the towns here, the West African region, a lot of people wouldn't really know about it because I would question certain people about it because I heard it from someone else. And some people wouldn't know, and some people would. I also met someone recently at a meeting where he said that he came from a place way out of the city that did this, and I was very curious about it. And if you ask them, they don't think it's right either. I wanted to take a moment to say that this isn't something that should be happening. We shouldn't be doing this. When I say we, I don't mean Africans in general. I mean human beings in general. Don't chain people to learn something, especially now that we have so many techniques to learn things and memorize things. It's not impossible to achieve these goals, memorization goals, in different ways. Now, he wrote a list of acts that he found reprehensible amongst the blacks. I won't be listing all of them because some of my listeners are under the age of 15, which is why I will be linking the document into the description box so anyone above 18 can read. Here is the passage. We halted near a channel at a large village which had been governed by a black, a pilgrim, and a man of fine character named Farba Maga. He was in the company of Sultan Mansa Musa. Farba Maga told me that when Mansa Musa came to this channel, he had with him a Qadi, a white man. This Qadi attempted to make away with 4,000 mithqals, and the Sultan, on learning it, was enraged at him and exiled him to the country of the heathen cannibals. He, the Qadi, lived among them for 4 years, at the end of which the Sultan sent him back to his own country. The reason why the heathens did not eat him was because he was white, for they say the white is indigestible because he is not ripe, whereas the black is ripe in their opinion. There was cannibalism in certain places. So there were the lands of the heathens. What he meant, heathens in this context, were people who were non Muslim. And this is also another testament to how their rulers did not take kindly to injustice. It looks like the Qadi during the time of Mansa Musa that they're explaining in the story is a white man, and he wanted to make away with some money, which he definitely shouldn't have. And upon learning it, the ruler was angry, and he sent him to the land of the cannibals. He did that on purpose. I believe he knew that the cannibals wouldn't eat him. He just wanted to give him a good scare for a good long 4 years, and then just sent him back to his lands. So this was one of the reprehensible characteristics Ibn Battuta was mentioning, the cannibalism in some areas, which wasn't widespread, of course, but this is one of them. And it's also another example of how the rulers didn't take kindly to shenanigans happening. So guys, that's about it for this podcast episode. We covered things Ibn Battuta has experienced in what is now what we call sub-Saharan Africa, Empire of Mali. We also covered the terminologies of what quote unquote black and white mean. Context matters. We have learned a lot about the place and the people and some of the customs in terms of gender dynamics, cultural dynamics, religious dynamics, and traditions. We also learned a little bit more about uh, the explorer himself, Ibn Battuta. I hope you have enjoyed this episode as much as I have, and I will see you guys in the next episode. Till next time.